Alright, so the first two Pokemon Reborn lore videos have been fairly serious in tone, which was appropriate given the topics that I discussed. But today we're going to discuss a character that has really grown on me recently, and I think she's one of the most underrated characters in all of Pokemon Reborn. Which I can't really blame that on the players given that she disappears for a good portion of the game, and even makes jokes about that when she comes back. I'm of course referring to the first gym leader, the electric type specialist, Julia. So when looking at Julia's contributions to the actual plot, there's not a whole lot to talk about. I mean, she helps you bust Team Meteor in the very beginning of the game, she gives you your first badge, and then she doesn't do anything until the Team Meteor raid on Fior Mansion. And that specific point in the game is actually kinda gonna be the focus of this video, because that's when Julia's characterization takes a turn for the interesting. Which I know is gonna sound weird to a lot of you, because to most players, Julia is like one of the most one-note characters who has kind of just this gimmick going on with her, in that she's really upbeat, really hyper, and kind of has this unique childish way of talking that makes her seem like an airhead. And like, she is an airhead, but not as much as people think. The reason most players won't get this moment of characterization that I'm talking about is because you need to get the alternate version of the Fior Mansion raid, which only happens if you beat the level 75 Garchomp owned by Solaris on Mount Pyrus, and most players just won't do that. But if you fulfill that requisite, then there's actually some extra dialogue between Fern and Florinia, which is going to warrant its own video for sure. And that causes Florinia to get distracted enough for Sirius to get the jump on her and actually incapacitate her. See, what usually happens in that sequence is that Florinia is your partner for all three battles in that raid. But if you get the alternate version of that, then Julia actually ends up being your partner for the last one against Solaris. And once you end up defeating Team Meteor, you actually get a scene where Titania sort of makes light of Florinia's injury, saying that she's used to overreacting to things, likely referring to her noodle incident with her that hasn't really been clarified upon. And here's when Julia just breaks character and snaps at Titania. And like, she really lets her have it for a second there, and it's a short exchange, but it's one with some pretty big implications for basically all of Julia's past antics, especially when later she emphasizes the need to stay upbeat for the sake of her friends. It's definitely not a complete facade though. A lot of that is her actual personality, because if you read her diary in the Onyx Academy, her tone of voice doesn't really change a whole lot at all. It's more than likely that she's just exaggerating her existing traits a little bit and attempting to lighten the mood whenever possible in order to uplift her friends. Which is really interesting because it kind of flips this trope on its head. You know, there's the trope of like the really upbeat and jovial character actually being really fucked up inside and using that facade to cheer themselves up. With Julia, it's kind of the opposite in the most selfless and best way possible. She's actually more or less fine, especially compared to her three best friends from the Onyx Academy, Florinia, Titania, and Amaria. Those four are all like best friends. And out of the four, it's kind of like, it's even weird in my head to say this, but Julia's the most normal one out of all of them. The rest of them have deeply ingrained psychological issues. Titania suffers from an extreme lack of empathy, and that didn't really help when she got into a loveless relationship with Amaria for the sake of Amaria, who's also deeply depressed and like suicidal. It's highly implied that Florinia suffered from basically the opposite issue as Titania, where she was overly empathetic to the point where when Titania hurt her feelings in that one incident, it affected her so deeply that it completely shifted her behavior, to the point where she just decided to overcompensate by throwing away her emotions altogether. And the thing is, Julia is aware of all of this. She's an airhead, but she's not oblivious, and this is pretty evident by subtle changes in tone in her dialogue later on in the game, after a lot of shit has happened with Amaria and Titania in particular. Going from pretty much blindly happy-go-lucky to concerned optimism. I might be reaching just a tad bit here, but Julia does really seem to recognize the sensitivities of her friends, given that she recognizes that she won't really be able to help too much by trying to interfere in their affairs directly, and instead tries her best to do anything in her power to help outside of that, given that just about everybody else in the game who gets involved in Titania, Maria, and Florinia's affairs only seem to make things worse, hence the player, for example. And so now I'll be pleasantly awaiting Julia's further interactions with the other 3 Onyx Academy girls, now that she's been sort of elevated for me from being just a tacky gimmick to an actual character. When it comes down to the essentials, past all of the quirkiness and explosions, Julia is just a simple girl who loves her friends to death above all else, which seems like something really cliche and uninteresting, but in the context of the rest of Pokemon Reborn's cast, where most of the characters either have some kind of psychological issue or are otherwise involved in some other dark affair, like with the Orphanage Sisters, then Julia all of a sudden is a really fresh and welcome addition to the cast. And that's all I have for you guys, so if you enjoyed, go ahead and leave a like, and I will see you guys next time.